Thank you. All I want to do with the next 2 hours of your life is just say that longer. So why did you fly me across the ocean for that? I have no idea. But I found good coffee. Well done. It was roasted in America. But what can I say? It's still really good. No, it's great to be with you. We Portlanders, we just inner homing beacon to single origin in every city we visit. Luke chapter 6, seriously, I just want to expand on that idea right now. Luke chapter 6, let's start again with Jesus. This is officially one of the shortest teachings of Jesus of all time. Take a look at 39. He also told them this parable, or this short story that is a teaching point. Can the blind lead the blind? Not a trick question. What is the answer? No. Will they not both fall into a pit? What's the answer? Yes. The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be, or that can be translated, will become like their teacher. Again, that word student is mathetes in the Greek. It's the same word that is later translated disciple, or as I said, we prefer apprentice. And the word teacher there, or master is rabbi. So this is a teaching about apprentices and the rabbi. And all I want to re-say again from this morning is one of the central goals of apprenticeship to Jesus is to become like him. And in Jesus' one little teaching here, we notice that there is a training to that. There's not a kind of one and done moment or zap from heaven. There is a process of training by which we, the apprentice, become like Jesus, the rabbi. Now, for most of us, the vision from this morning of be with Jesus, become like Jesus, that one in particular, and do what he did, means that we have to change, to become these, not just to behave this way, but to become these kinds of people from the heart or the core of our being out. And by change, I don't mean like a little self-help with a Jesus like vanilla shot in your latte kind of change. For most of us, for me, it is a radical overhaul of my interior and exterior person, the whole soul over. Turn over to Romans chapter 12 to the right. Romans, if you're familiar with Romans, which is a letter technically, but it reads like a theological salvo. And after 11 chapters of theology, you kind of hit the apex moment. Chapter 12, verse 1, Paul writes this: "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, in view of all that God has done for you in and through Christ in context, offer your bodies, your whole, all that you are, as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." Not just music, which is wonderful, but that's a gateway to all of you. "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but instead be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." Now that word transform, notice Paul's play on words. Do not be conformed, instead be transformed. That word there is metamorphao in Greek, where we get the English word metamorphos for when a caterpillar is changed into a butterfly. Merriam-Webster defines transformation as, quote, "a profound change in form from one stage to the next in the life history of an organism, as from the caterpillar to the pupa, and from the pupa to the adult butterfly." And this is the word used all through the New Testament, in particular by Paul, but by all of the writers, for the kind of change that is on offer through apprenticeship to Jesus. Now, as nice as that sounds, I think the question that I just want to open with this afternoon is, if we're honest, is that kind of change actually possible? Now, before you jump in and give the right Christian answer, because you know what the right Christian answer is, yes, of course, just take a moment, like pretend it's just you in your mind, right? And you're there, honest, semi-rational life experience. Does this offer match your life experience of church and your life with Jesus? This level of deep, radical overhaul, transformation from the inside out. Is this kind of change possible? And if so, how? Because we don't really know each other, by way of a short autobiography, I grew up in the church. My dad was a first-generation follower of Jesus who became a pastor, and just it's all I've ever known. By the time I was 30 years old, I was leading a megachurch, which is very American to do. And on the surface, I was doing quite well. But under the surface, I was stuck in my journey with Jesus. My experience, and I've come to realize this is the experience of many other followers of Jesus, was that early on in my journey, in particular through kind of college and my 20s, kind of dealing with the kind of more surface level behavior stuff of character, I felt like I was tracking. Year over year, I felt more in tune with Jesus, more like Jesus. But once we got through kind of the surface layer stuff, all of a sudden I was stuck. Once I began to deal with my kind of personality, which is its own desperate need of salvation in and of itself, and my family of origin, and my cultural background, and deeply ingrained habits of mind and body that were less than human flourishing, all of a sudden, the formula that I grew up with of read the Bible, pray, and go to church, it just wasn't a bad formula. It just wasn't, if I was honest, it was not working anymore. I was stuck. I just hit this plateau. And there were just large portions of my soul that somehow my life with Jesus had yet to transform. I was racked by anxiety. For a while, I was on medication for that. I was quite unhappy, to be honest. I felt more and more like a failure as a husband. I was just really not, I wasn't like, a serial adulterer or something like that. I was just grouchy. And that's pretty bad if you have to live with somebody who's just unpleasant and unkind. I'm perfectionistic and critical by nature, or I was, or I don't know what I am anymore, something. And I'd yet to honestly come to grips with the fact that much of what I called, calling from God was in fact ambition and ego and workaholism. And, I was not very self-aware or in touch with what I'll later call my shadow side. I was still discovering not only my potential, but I'd yet to really come to grips with my limitations and accept the limitations of my person and my story and God's call. And I just felt stuck. I remember saying that to my wife, I just feel stuck. The problem in my case wasn't that I did not want to change. I wanted to change really bad. And it wasn't that I wasn't trying to change. I was trying to change really hard, too hard, if anything. I'm very type A, very driven. If anything, perfectionistic. I was trying too hard. The problem was that I did not know how to change. Then I hit this, to add more disillusionment to the already millennial disillusionment that's just there for all of us. I hit this wall as a pastor when I started to realize, dang, my church is full of people like me. You're thinking, yes. I remember Pete Scazzaro has this line, as the leaders go, so goes the church. And I just thought, oh no, now we're in trouble. If the rest of the church is like me, this can't be right. And I just began to realize, man, there are people in our community that have been around church for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And they're good people. These aren't bad people. But if we set Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as the bar for success, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, if you've not read it, which often people want to write off as this hyper-idealistic, and the bar is set high, but read the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is brutally honest and down to earth. He assumes that you will want to lust after and objectify women in particular, that you will look at contempt and anger, not just anger because somebody crossed you, but contempt thinking you are better than somebody else, that you will worry about things that in the scheme of eternity don't really matter, that you'll do the right things, such as the spiritual disciplines, prayer and fasting, for all of the wrong reasons, that you will judge other people. Does that sound at all like your life or mine? So when people write off the Sermon on the Mount, there's a long running tradition since Martin Luther and others of just kind of, let's explain this away. The bar is set but it's brutally honest about the human condition. But the beauty of it is Jesus' open, honest transparency about the temptation of all of us and the wound that we all carry, but yet the bar is set high. And if that was the bar for success, becoming the kind of people that Jesus put out in the Sermon on the Mount, not only was I nowhere close, but the vast majority of our church, after many of them decades in church, were nowhere close to Jesus. And then it hit me that what was true of me was true of them as well. It's not that they did not want to change. Most of them did very badly. And it's not that they weren't trying to change. Many of them were. It's that they, like me, did not know how to change. It's my experience that most followers in the West, of Jesus in the West, do not have a working theory of change. If you were to actually just pull somebody out of the audience, I won't do this to you, and just say, okay, so you are this person, and on the horizon, this is who you have the potential to become in apprenticeship to Jesus. Very different person. How do you change? How do you become that person? My experience, just think about that. Maybe just take a moment. How would you answer that question? And don't feel like right or wrong. Just in my experience, most people have never thought about it. Or most people devolve to Christianese, like, I'm just like trusting on the wings of God to carry me. And I love poetry. I love Psalms, love Isaiah. But then if you drill through the BS, what do you actually mean by that? Flying on the wings, wonderful. Let's sing that. What do you do tomorrow morning? Or what does God do or whatever? Or people will just say, well, I just believe God does all the work. And to which the answer is then, well, why is he not doing it on you? or no, I'm kidding. Come on. Do we know each other well enough for that yet? Oh, I'm still very much in process. But in all honesty, if you had asked me, even 5, 6, 7 years ago, and this is me through Bible college, through seminary, lead pastor of a large church, how do people change? Do you think that's the first thing they would teach you in seminary? We never talked about it once. Went through 7 years of higher education around Bible and theology. We never once talked about how people change. And so honestly, I had either no working theory of change or just one that was handed to me that honestly I never really even thought about critically. I think if I had to articulate it, it would be something like, read your Bible and pray in the morning, go to church a lot, try really hard, but somehow do it in the Spirit's power, and then God does the rest. And again, all of that's good stuff, and that will deal with the surface level issues in your life. But that, in my experience, will not take you where you want to go with Jesus and where Jesus is calling you and me to go. So what I want to do with you today is I've been on this journey the last 5 years. I quit my job, radically kind of overhauled my life, and have spent the last half a decade really just in some pretty intense reading and research, both through self and life, around what is a working theory of change. And I do not have all the answers, but I want to offer you some, at least a shot at some of them. And I want to work with you just with my working theory of change based on the teachings of Jesus, the writings of the New Testament, and much of which has been confirmed more recently by the field of psychology and sociology. So, to begin, what we talk about when we talk about change is spiritual formation. Hence the name of today's event, Formatio, which is from the Latin, just to make you all feel smarter than most of us really are. And this language of spiritual formation is kind of in the Bible. That exact term is not. If you've been around the church any length of time, it's just updated language for sanctification, because that word that's a whole other story. We don't use it in the way it's used by Paul in the New Testament, and often it comes with that kind of just use willpower and try really hard to be holy kind of mindset. And so spiritual formation is updated with really, you could say, more modern research from psychology. Really a better way to frame that is more ancient methodology. Remember that prior to the Enlightenment, theology, philosophy, and psychology were not separate disciplines. The vicar or the priest was called the cure of souls. In Latin, it's cure. That can be translated both care and cure. His specialty or her specialty was the health and growth of the soul, which is the whole person. You read any of the early church fathers, mothers, you read the mystics, you read St. Teresa, Catherine of Siena, you read St. John of the Cross. They sound way more like Christian psychologists than Christian theologians. So all that to say, in my mind, the kind of late modern secular, let's divvy this up, and the pastor pastor will talk about prayer and the Bible and everything else goes to the secular arena is just not helpful. So there's an ancient kind of marriage here that more and more goes by the name of spiritual formation. It is tied to language from the New Testament. That word formation is used here. It's from metamorphao, and there are different iterations of it used by Paul. It's translated formed or transformed or conformed. It's all language used throughout the New Testament. Spiritual formation is, put simply, the process by which we are transformed from the inside out to become more like Jesus, and in doing so, our real true self. Dallas Willard defines it this way: spiritual formation in the Christian tradition is a process of increasingly, in just a little bit of time, being possessed and permeated by the character traits of Jesus as we walk in the easy yoke of discipleship with Jesus, our teacher. I love that. Robert Mulholland defines it as being formed into the image of Christ for the sake of others. Now, here's the key idea we need to begin with. Spiritual formation is not a Christian thing. It's a human thing. At an anthropological level, to be human is to be dynamic, not static, meaning every minute of every day, right now, you are being formed into somebody. You're being shaped, if you prefer. Put another way, as I said this morning, we're all disciples of somebody or something. The question is not, are you a disciple or are you an apprentice? It's who or what are you an apprentice of? Who or what are you being formed or shaped into? You know, C.S. Lewis, his great line was that all of us are becoming either immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. Case point, and I hesitate always with this because it could come off ageist. I don't mean it that way. But just run through your mental Rolodex of elderly people. What you will, if you think about it, most elderly people, and I don't mean like, 40-year-olds. I mean, it's a young crowd. I just feel like I have to say that. 80s plus, most elderly people are either the best people you know, right? They're either you're like, I don't think you've sinned since 1987. Why are you still at church? I was just with my wife's grandmother who's dying right now in palliative care. She's, I think, 96 years old. Husband's dead. She's just rough. Just had a fall, broke her hip. Really rough. I sat with her at Thanksgiving, American holiday. Don't worry about it. And you all know what it is, though. That's the thing. We have Hollywood. It's just not fair because you all know what I'm saying, and I don't know what most of you are saying. Anyway, Hollywood. What can I say? You have Lord of the Rings. There you have Peter Jackson. I sat with her at Thanksgiving, and for about 30 minutes, I'm just chatting with her, and I'm trying to get her to complain unsuccessfully. The most negative thing I could get her to say was, getting old is just for the birds. That's the worst thing I could get her to say. And she's this 96-year-old, devout, Catholic, quiet, wonderful soul. Most elderly people are either the best or, in all honesty, the worst. Angry, bitter, manipulative, mad at the world, selfish. I have other grandparents I could talk about, but I won't, to honor them. How many 85-year-olds do you know that are just kind of normal? I don't know any. I know saints, and I know, what did Lewis call them? Immortal horrors, or on the way to becoming that. And I say that, again, not in an ageist way. I mean that with respect. Because it's easy, this is a young room. In your 20s, you feel, even in your 30s to an extent, who you are feels pretty fluid. You kind of have this sense of who will I become? Then you hit, I'm 38, so I don't know what it's like down. You hit your 30s, 40s, and you kind of have this sense of, this is who I became? Dang it. And you feel less and less fluid. There's a whole other teaching I could hear on the role of how, habits turn into character turns into destiny. And that's easy to forget when you are 23 or 29 or 34. But if you need and it's also easy to forget when most of the people you know are followers of Jesus. All right, those of you that work in the workplace, think about most older people that are not followers of Jesus. They will come to you very different emotionally than most younger people who are not followers of Jesus. All that is because spiritual formation is a human thing. Whether you're atheist, Christian, Buddhist, it doesn't matter. You are becoming somebody, and so am I. Now, on that note, all I want to do for the next 4 hours is, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. They did not give me a clear time to be done with, so I'm just going to run with that. I have 2 spiritual formation paradigms that I want to walk you through today, which is, again, just my best shot. This first one, throw the slide up, is what we back home call unintentional spiritual formation. I know that's lousy language, but all I mean by unintentional spiritual formation is this is how you and I are formed or shaped with little to no intention on your part or mine. Meaning if you don't really think about it, you just kind of wake up tomorrow morning and you do whatever you do on a Sunday, wake up Monday, do whatever you do on a Monday, just kind of go about your life, go about how kind of people in your socioeconomic range or your community or your circle of friends, you just kind of live. This is how you are being formed. And again, this here is just my best synthesis and simplification of what I've come to realize. First off, we're all, sip of your good coffee, or our good coffee. I'm not sure it's from America, actually, but we'll take it. First off, we're being formed by the stories that we believe. By story, all I mean by that is a narrative to make some kind of coherent sense of the complexity of reality. Another word for this is worldview from sociology, the lens through which we see the world. In psychology, we call it mental maps. Babette Buster, the famous screenwriter, calls human beings narrative animals. Our central nervous system is literally wired to find meaning in every single way that we possibly can. Mental maps is the most helpful language for me. Think about a map that you have in your mind of how to get from your apartment or house to work on Monday morning. You get in your car or on your bicycle or whatever, however you do life here, and you navigate the route from your apartment to your work or class or whatever by that mental map. In the same way that we have mental maps for how to get to the office or how to get to your class, we have mental maps for everything. Mental maps for sexuality, for gender, for relationships, for marriage, for spirituality, for money, for community, for racial reconciliation. We have mental maps for everything. If your mental maps are accurate, if they correspond to reality, then you get to your destination. You show up to reality well, you flourish and thrive. If they're not accurate, well, you get lost. And it's not a big deal to get lost on your way to your office, but it often is a big deal to get lost in your sexuality, your gender, your relationships, your marriage, your spirituality, whatever it is. Lost is the word that was used by Jesus, and it's a respectful term. Lost people are not less intelligent. Lost people are not bad morally. They just are lost. And many of us, all of us were lost pre-Jesus. My point is just that life is complex, so we have to come up with some kind of a story to make sense of all of it. Secularism, which claims to be objective data, is a story. It is an interpretation of scientific data that may or may not correspond to reality. And then once you come up with a story, then you begin to live in that script. You know, my friend Pete likes to say the story you live in is the story you live out. We could go through endless examples. You know, let's take, obviously, I'm guessing your country is similar to mine, where the bleeding edge of the conversation right now around morality and spirituality is around sexuality. Think about the story of secularism, which basically says you are an animal with time and chance on your side. Sex is just biological, it's just play for grown-ups. It's just a biological coupling of two bodies, of meat, right? What's the big deal? Who has it ever hurt? Which is bizarre. Who has it not ever hurt? But okay, who has it ever hurt? Like, seriously, who hasn't been hurt by sexuality? But who has it ever hurt? Marriage, gender itself, how you do relationships. This is just social construct made up. It was mostly to do with white patriarchy and money from the Byzantine era. And basically, just do whatever feels good in the moment as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. If that's a story, that's not science. That's an interpretation of the data points of science and philosophy and religion. If that's the story that you believe, that you put your trust in, that will give shape to how you enjoy and express your sexuality. Compare and contrast that with the story of Jesus, right? You are an image bearer of God. You are not an animal. You are as much like God as you are like an ape. You are this beautiful intermediary between the creator and the creation, made to rule over the animal kingdom. and you are a higher consciousness and being created in God with design, with intentionality, with purpose, everything about your sexuality, everything about your soul has been set in motion by God, but has also been racked and set loose by sin. And now you're not what you were meant to be, but yet you're becoming who you really are. And as you live, and sexuality is way more than play for grown-ups. It is the fusing of two souls into one flesh. And the only relational container strong enough to hold that kind of raw nuclear power is two people who say, until death, I am with you no matter what. Everything else outside of that is, no matter what PR scheme it goes through, is dehumanizing. It does not honor and respect and love the person. Those are radically different stories. And we could go through money. We could go through the capitalistic mantra of the more you have, the happier you are, and that's the route. And we could say that's a story. Does that story correspond to reality? Do you feel happier the more stuff you get? Right? Does it quench the deep ache in your soul? Do you just buy that 9th pair of shoes and just feel, now I have meaning and purpose in life, or whatever, you know? Do you buy the car and all of a sudden transform into the model in the advertisement for it and just never have a sad day ever again, and you're just yachting every day, or whatever it is? Yachting a verb? I don't know, but it looks so cool, all the yachts down by the harbor. I just want to be rich and live in New Zealand. But my point is, these are stories, right? So my point is just, we are shaped by the stories that, one, we're just exposed to, and then that we begin to live into. Secondly, we're formed by our habits. This is an area where theology, philosophy, and psychology all agree that the things we do on a regular basis do something to us. Again, very simple idea that few of us have really had to grapple with yet. All sorts of work has been done over the last few decades in the field of psychology to point out what Charles Duhigg, in his best-selling book called The Power of Habit. Basic idea is that we are little more than the cumulative effect of our daily and weekly habits over a lifetime. What we do on a regular basis, we become. Said another way, the things we do something to us. Because, and this is key, our habits get at the core of our being, and they shape us not through our prefrontal cortex, but in scientific language, through our limbic system. They get into us through our loves and our longings. The best analogy I can think of for this is coffee. So, how many of you liked coffee when you were a kid? Okay, 2 of you, exactly. It's an acquired taste. So I've read all the stuff that says this is bad for me. If you know me, I struggle with anxiety, I'm way too intense, I'm type A, I have a hard time falling asleep at night. The last thing I need to begin my day on an empty stomach is a jolt of caffeine. Like that, I need mindfulness hour or something, not caffeine. So, and I've read all of the stuff. There was a point about maybe 5 years ago when I was in this kind of stepped down from the church, and I got into therapy, and I went on a sabbatical, and I did all this stuff, and I was all about health, and I started running triathlons, and I went off coffee for about 6 months. And I slept better at night. I needed less sleep. I woke up without my alarm clock. I was calmer. I had more mental focus and acuity through the day. And finally, I just gave it up. I said, it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. It's too high of a price to pay, you know? Now think about that. That was not a rational decision, all right? That had nothing to do with a data set or academic essay that I read around caffeine and its role on the human body. That was about my loves and my longings. I had become the kind of person who, addicted is a strong word, I was in love with coffee, right? How did I fall in love with coffee? Well, when I was 17 years old, I got a job at a coffee shop. And I thought coffee was gross. It was just the cool place to work. So this was the late 90s. I would have a mocha, which was basically just dairy and chocolate with a tiny bit of coffee in it. And then over time, the mocha became a vanilla latte, and then the latte became just a latte, and then it became a flat white, and then it became single origin, and then it became $13 a cup, and all of the stuff, right? So the slow evolution over time through the daily habit of just drinking coffee in the morning, I became the kind of person who loves coffee. It's become part of my identity, part of my calling in life. My point is, it was not a rational decision. This is why habits are so evocative and so under the radar, because you think you're just watching Netflix. You think you're just working another hour at the office. You think you're just on social media a little bit too much. Actually, you are choosing the kind of person that you're becoming. These things that you do are doing something to you for negative or for positive. You think you're just reading the Bible in the morning. You're like, well, that was weird. Exodus, okay. You think you're just at church again. You're like, who's the American? Okay, okay, great. Actually, the spiritual disciplines are doing something to you. More about that later. My point is your habits get in at the core of your being and form you. Third, we're formed by our relationships. This is kind of common knowledge, but we become like the people that we spend time with on a regular basis. It's easy to think about your circle of friends. Most likely, part of that's the psychological dynamic of like attracts like. I love it when I meet somebody and I'm like, Andy, you're like 30-something and you wear a t-shirt and you like coffee and you're into music, but you kind of care about the church. I like you. You remind me of me. I like you so much. You must be fantastic. We don't actually love them. We love ourselves. And so when there are people that mirror us back to us, we're like, you think like me, vote like me. You're into Chance the Rapper too? Wonderful. Here we are together, the whole thing. And so we see that with our circle of friends. Seriously, we become like the people we're around. Often things, whether it's ethical things, entertainment is a great example. That's right. Or environmental things. We just kind of assume are normal because everybody else is doing it. Even if it's crazy, we're all going off the cliff together, right? Nowhere is this more true than our family of origin, which will, for most of us outside of Jesus, is the greatest spiritual formation machine on your life, for good or for bad, or for many of us, a mixed bag. And then, of course, for our culture around as well. And again, this is just neutral. This is just an observation. It can be good or bad. We become like the people that we spend time with. Finally, all of this happens in an environment. You don't live in a vacuum. You live in a lovely city, Auckland, New Zealand. You live in a neighborhood in the city. You live in a culture. You live in an ethnic heritage. You live into all of this. If your city is anything like mine, my city is a formation machine. It is intentionally trying to form me into a very specific kind of person. Some of it is great. It just wants me to recycle everything and ride my bike everywhere and, care about social justice. Some of it's wonderful. Some of it is really dark. Some of it is really messed up. Some of it is really hostile to Jesus and to human flourishing. The danger is the longer that you live in a city or an environment of any kind, the more you become like that city or like that environment, and the more you're the blind with the blind. The more blind we become to the ways that our city has formed us. I read that little book, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, forgive me. I think it's Hui, Come Home, whatever. I said it wrong. I'm so sorry. American, what can I say? Just beat me later. But just reading about, it was a beautiful read about your country, but just the gravity, the weight, the tragedy of colonialism, and the way that people were so enculturated, they didn't realize they were enculturated. And it's so easy to point the finger. It's so easy to look back and think, how could they ever have done that? But yet, we're still doing the exact same thing. We forget that colonialization now is no longer about geography, it's about ideology. I come from one of the most progressive cities in our country, and let me tell you, there is ideological full-on colonization that is borderline violent. You have to think this way, or we will pariah you till no end. My point is, the goal now isn't to conquer the territory of the world, it's to conquer the idea systems of the world. It's still this exact same human thing, and often we're so blind to it, we don't even realize the ways that we've been formed by our environment. Whether it's our city or, of course, the digital age. Now we all kind of live two places at once. Why I can travel here from the other side of the world, and most of what we say to each other translates. And we kind of all dress the same and think the same, and you have a great little coffee shop right up the road, just like we have a great little coffee shop up the road, and you sing beautiful. It's so similar, because as the world is getting bigger, it's also getting smaller. My point is that the stories we believe, the habits we live into, our relationships, and our environment, all of this forms us into a very specific kind of a person. Just set morality aside, for good or for bad, just forms you. All of this happens over time. All right, think about the difference of an immigrant or emigrant or whatever, somebody who's been in Auckland for a few months versus a few years versus a few decades. Like, I don't know your city well enough yet to know this stereotype. I know my city. Like, you can tell whenever somebody's come from like the South or Texas or even Southern California, you're like, wow, you drive a truck. What is wrong with you? You know what I mean? Like, you'll just see somebody new to the city in some like F450 or some giant truck. Like, where do you parallel? I live in the city. It's like everybody's on bicycles and in hybrids if you're really a sinner, you know? Like where are you gonna park that thing? You're like, you must be new here, right? And they have an American flag on the back and a gun and like, who knows what they are, you know? Like, you will not last. Trust me. 3 years from now, you'll be like making your own hemp breakfast or whatever. Bicycling everywhere and recycling your toilet. I mean, just everything, all of the stuff, you know? But my point is, like, you can tell somebody who's new, I don't know what the stereotype is here, but somebody who's new to somebody who's been around, where it happens, and that's what's so tricky about it, is it's the frog in the water analogy, you know? It's like so slow, so gradual, so incremental, that often for good or for bad, often like you'll wake up and you'll realize, oh my gosh, I've been transformed by Jesus. I used to really struggle with this, and now it just feels like a non-issue. Or the opposite, you wake up and think, I said I would never cross this line ever, and that line is 10 feet over there, right? Because it's so slow. And then, of course, all of this through experiences. Good, bad, divorce, you have a child, you don't have a child, you make a lot of money, you go bankrupt, you experience trauma, you live your best life now, whatever it is. My point is, all of this has an effect on who we become. And listen, all you have to do is wake up in the morning and do whatever it is you do. You don't need a life coach to do this. You don't need to make a plan. You don't need like a day to plan out 2019. And all you need to just do whatever it is you do. Just wake up, live in Auckland, hang out, go to church, whatever it is you do, just do it. And all of this is at work in you. 3-minute break, don't go anywhere. Turn to your neighbor, talk about it. I'll call you back in 3 minutes. Introverts, I'm sorry. Go for it. Okay, come on back. Now, let's move on to a working theory of change. How do we not just change in general, but more specifically, how do we, through our apprenticeship to Jesus, change to become more like Jesus and our real true self? Now, before we move on to paradigm number 2, first, there are 2, I don't know if myths is the right word, or misconceptions that I want to, in love, beat up on a little bit, that I think are the kind of gut, uncritical kind of working theory of most followers of Jesus in the West. Neither of these are lies. They're both half-truths, which are kind of the most dangerous things out there, because most of what I'm about to say in each myth or misconception is true. It's just not enough for it to actually work. Now, the first myth is basically all you need to do is know the Bible. So this again, I don't know your church background. If you come from a Reformed background, or if you come from more of a Bible church background, or more Bible teaching background, which I know there's a lot of Vineyard and other streams of the church here, but this is kind of the working theory of change. Teach, preach, study the Bible, put that into you, and you will become more like Jesus. We might not actually say that, but that's just kind of what we kind of assume. A little bit of history to this. 400 years ago in the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, who did amazing things and horrible things all at the same time, his theory of what he would have called sanctification, what we now call spiritual formation, was basically, and this is my reading of him, so ask a Luther scholar to correct me here, but I think his basic theory was that transformation happens through two things. One, the preaching of the gospel, by which he meant sermons, so not just evangelism, but kind of preaching the Bible, teaching the gospel of Jesus. And two, the sacraments. He was still essentially Catholic in his view of the Lord's Supper. So if you were to ask Luther, Luther, how do we change? I think he would have said something like, you come to church on Sunday, or even Mass daily, you hear the preaching and teaching of the Bible and the gospel, you come to the table, you take the bread and the cup, and that is how you change. Now, fast forward a few hundred years to the evangelical kind of wing, great-great-grandchild of Luther and the Reformation, and most of us ditched the sacraments with the exception of our Anglican friends. Well done. And so, right or wrong, what you're left with, unless if you're Anglican, is basically preaching of the gospel, which again we define as sermons. And so the working theory of spiritual formation that many pastors and churches and followers of Jesus, myself until quite recently, work off is just make sure you're in a Jesus-centered kind of gospel preaching, Bible teaching church, and you will change. The problem is I have spent my entire life in those churches, Jesus-centered, gospel preaching, Bible teaching, exegetical, thoughtful, and I just know a lot of people that know Romans wicked well and are nothing like Jesus or very far from Christ likeness. And Luther was brilliant. I mean, in his time, just what he did for you, for me, for the church, not just in the West, but around the world, absolute. He was incredible. But brilliant as he was coming of age, right, kind of prior to the Enlightenment, and that kind of thinking and that worldview that was just beginning with him and many others had a new vision of what a human being was, a new anthropology. René Descartes, obviously, whose influence is all over the Western world, said, his famous line, I think, therefore I am. He called human beings res cogitans in Latin, or thinking things. He's one of the first theorists to basically say, you are essentially a brain on legs. And again, this is a half-truth. In many, you could argue that you are primarily a mind, but even if that is true, you are not just. So much of you is more. And this view of what it means to be human has shaped the West as a whole, not just the church. Our entire education system is based on this idea, information out, because our education system is not based on character formation, which is what ancient education was. Liberal arts used to mean something totally different than it means now. Liberty used to mean something totally different than it does now. And so we no longer educate people to form them into a virtuous image. We educate them to give knowledge and information into their head. And because this whole view, information in, output is your person. The problem is, at a spiritual level, at a scientific level, everybody, whether you're an atheist, psychologist, or an ancient mystic, or theologian, everybody knows this is not true. We are more, not less, but more than a brain on legs. We are human. If this view, this kind of Descartesian Enlightenment Western worldview of what it means to be human was right, all we would have to do is get the right information into our head. If you've ever tried to lose weight, how does that work for you? In my experience, as I age and I put on a few pounds once in a while, I'm like, dang it. I wish all I had to do was read a dieting book or listen to a 3-part podcast on the ketotarian diet or whatever. Boom, done, no problem. But how does that work for you when you're sitting there and the chips and hummus are on the table and there's red wine with it and then there's dessert after? Dang it. At that point, the problem is not up here. The problem is not a lack of information. You have all sorts of other problems, and a lack of information is not something. Jamie K. Smith, who's a Christian philosopher I love, tells this story about, he's from the Midwest of America, which if you've ever been there, it's just horrible food. And he tells the story about how his wife, who's lovely, was getting all into kind of plant-based, local, organic, farm-to-table diet. And he wasn't into it. He's from the Midwest, but he's an intellectual. And so he said, okay, give me a book. So she gave him a book. And he's sitting there reading this book on the slow food movement. And it's amazing. He's like, he's getting all like highlighting and taking notes in the margins. And he's like, yes, yes, yes. And then he looks up and he realizes, this won't translate here. Dang it. Do you have Costco here? You have Costco here. You know what it is. Americans. Is it on TV or something? Oh my gosh. He looks up and he realizes he's sitting in the Costco food court eating a hot dog. You know what a hot dog is, right? And that's like the worst of America on so many different levels. It is the antithesis of everything he's literally eating a hot dog from Costco while reading about the slow food movement. And in his mind, he's like, yes, yes, yes. But in his mouth, he's yes, yes, yes at the same time. Oh, it's so true. Laurie Santos of Yale calls this the G.I. Joe fallacy. Anybody grew up in G.I. Joe? I'm dating myself a little bit here. 80s, right? So you remember the cartoons used to end with like this little public service announcement where there's this little end cartoon and you'd have like a 12-year-old kid. It was like a down power line or whatever, and he would like get close to the electricity, and then one of the G.I. Joe guys would show up, or girls would show up in the tank or the helicopter or whatever, and would say, don't touch a live wire, or whatever the thing is. And then the kid would say, thank you, G.I. Joe, now I know. And G.I. Joe would say, say what? And knowing is half the battle. I thought you were into G.I. Joe. One of you. Come on, thank you. Knowing is half the battle. Laurie Santos calls this the G.I. Joe fallacy. Knowing is not half the battle. I don't know what percentage it is, maybe 10 or 20%. It is the beginning. Without knowledge, you do not get very far at all. But it is not half the battle. It is not known, because knowing something is not the same as doing something, which is still not the same as wanting to do something, which is still not the same as becoming the kind of person who naturally wants to do the thing. If it was, all you'd have to do is read your Bible and you would be transformed in the image of Jesus. Now, again, I'm all for reading the Bible. Don't misread that. My point is just, you can't think your way to Christ-likeness. Because as we said this morning, the way of Jesus is not just a set of ideas. It's a way of life, and more than that, it's the kind of person that you become as you are transformed by the Spirit of His love. I have a friend down in San Francisco who runs this thing that he calls the Jesus Dojo. Yes, so cheesy. Don't tell him I said that. And I sat with him, I said, dude, why? It's so San Francisco. Why would you call this spiritual formation thing the Jesus Dojo? And he said, most of our churches are set up like university lecture halls, but following Jesus is way more like learning karate than it is like learning biology. And like, think of like wax on, wax off, right? You think you're just reading your Bible in the morning. No, wax on, wax. You saw that movie here, right? It was a thing. Yeah, anyway. Do you have the Karate Kid in New Zealand? Yes, you do. And he just said that trying to learn how to follow Jesus by doing nothing but listening to sermons and reading books would be like trying to learn how to do karate with just like watching YouTube videos and reading books. Again, both of those are fantastic. They're a great beginning point. But at some point, you have to actually move to practice. The problem is that even in the most anti-intellectual churches, so fringe charismatic or Pentecostal or just more kind of rural, whatever it would be in your country, the most like anti-academic, anti-scholarship, anti-theology heady, most of the approaches to discipleship are almost entirely intellectual. Come to church on Wednesday night, and by intellectual I don't mean like cerebral, but I mean information-based. Come to church on Wednesday night and study the Bible, read this book with your small group and talk about it, meet Joe every Thursday morning for coffee to go through this book by whoever and talk about it. Again, all wonderful things. But you can do those for 30 years and not be transformed. That's the beginning of transformation. It's not the middle or the end. So that's the first myth. Second myth that I think is more popular in kind of the charismatic stream or the Pentecostal stream. I know many of you come out of that stream here. And again, both of these are beautiful streams of the church. It sounds a little bit more like you don't have to do anything. It's all God. And you will hear this sometimes from a hyper-Calvinistic view where there's this paranoia of good works. You hear it more from a Pentecostal or a charismatic. I call it the matrix theory of spiritual formation. Like, remember that scene when Trinity is on the top of the skyscraper, and like they're in trouble, and it's the famous scene, right, with the thing or whatever, and there's a helicopter there, and she gets in the helicopter, and she says like, I need a download for a Huey, whatever it is, and then her eyes like flutter for a little minute, and they give her the computer download, and all of a sudden, she is an expert helicopter pilot, and she lifts off, and they do like this barrel roll and save the day. That's like, I think, how a lot of Pentecostals and charismatics think about spiritual formation. You know, like, I'm just gonna come to church and be like, I need a download for whatever it is. And it's like, oh, just wait for it, boom, go out and do it kind of thing. And again, I am a charismatic, so don't misread me. I believe in the power of encounter. That life with God often comes down to moments. But my experience with encounter is that when we tell stories of people who encounter God and worship by singing or wherever it is, most of the time, they are stories about healing and about freedom, not about maturity. Now, healing and freedom, again, are key. They're the beginning. You can't get to maturity until you deal with a father wound, a mother wound, an addiction, whatever. Most of the time when we stand up, we hear stories, I was addicted to, you fill in the blank, and I had this encounter with God at this retreat, at this day, and my life, during this song, people prayed over me, prophesied over me, I was radically changed. Or I had this father wound. I was just living from bitterness and anger. I could not go near, men, or I could not have any kind of intimacy and openness in my relationships or whatever. And there was this moment I was prayed over, I was prophesied, or I unlocked something in me, and I just feel not perfect, but set free. You hear these beautiful stories that are absolutely key. Some of you, that's the next step in your journey. You need an encounter with God. You need healing and you need freedom. I have never heard somebody come up on stage and say, you know what? I was just really lazy and irresponsible. And I was just kind of on my phone all the time, and I would sleep in most of the time, and I just was kind of undisciplined in my habits. And I had this encounter with God. The next morning, I woke up at 4 a.m. I fasted, then I read through all of Leviticus, then I prayed in tongues, and then I prayed for the poor, and then I went to CrossFit, and then I went to the office 10 minutes early, went to inbox 0, and I've just not heard that story. You know what I mean? My point is, again, please don't misread me. These are half-truths. The power of the Spirit in encounter for healing and for freedom, and even for often growth, is immeasurable. I'm 110% into it. But we have to move past healing and freedom into Christ-like maturity. And that often is something a little bit different. The reality is, we'll talk about this in a minute, but change, spiritual formation, is a joint venture between you and God. Augustine, who ironically became the founder of Calvinistic thought, which is kind of theologically most uncomfortable with this idea of you having responsibility or you even playing a role in your transformation. Augustine was the one who said, without him we can't, but without us he won't. There is a joint partnership between you and Jesus. And now, I don't think it's a 50-50 partnership. I don't know what the statistical breakdown is. Is it 99-1 or 90-10 or 80-20? I have no idea. I think the primary heavy lifting is all done by the Spirit and the truth of God. More on that in a minute. But you have a role to play, a responsibility. Many people are frustrated, even bitter at the church, over the lack of transformation in their life, and it's because they are not aware of the responsibility that they carry. I don't understand the human nature in this. I know that to the Genesis story, the human condition is always to pass the buck to somebody else. The only person that doesn't pass the buck in the Genesis story is the serpent, which is fascinating. Adam blames Eve and Eve blames the serpent. And I think, as a father, I can just tell you, none of my children naturally take responsibility for anything. All of them just have a PhD in blame shifting by age 3. And it could just be my sinfulness in that, or my wife's sinfulness in them. She's not here to defend herself, right? I think it's just the human condition. I think there's a part of us that often doesn't want to own that responsibility. And again, we'll talk about this in a minute. The responsibility is just basically, my therapist calls it doing the work. And he doesn't mean striving to try really hard to become virtuous. What you discover that the work actually is to slow your life down, open your whole person up to the Spirit and truth of God, meet God in your crap and in your pain, and let God transform you. That's the work, which isn't really work. It's more like just actually meeting God where you have an ache. So all that to say, these two myths or misconceptions, both of which have a full measure of truth, the role of the mind, talk about that in a minute, the role of encounter in the Spirit, huge. Spirit and truth is huge. But they aren't the whole enchilada, as we would say back home. So all of that leads me back to the question, how do we change? Well, have a look at this. I'll do this as fast as I can. This is what I call intentional spiritual formation. I wish we had a megachurch screen to put these two side by side. But all of this is counter that last paradigm, okay? So this is, whatever our formation into Jesus' image is, it has to be counter formation to the stories we believe, our habits, our relationships, Auckland, New Zealand, time, and experience. So counter the stories that we believe is teaching. Again, Jesus was a teacher. So when people beat up on teaching or the role of the Bible or the sermon, you have a little problem. Jesus came as a Bible teacher, as a rabbi. That's what he was. It's what he spent the bulk of his time doing. What is a teacher? A teacher is a truth teller. He or she is a conduit of truth. What is truth? Truth is reality. Best way I know to define reality is what you bump into when you're wrong, right? So he was a conveyor of truth or reality, and we need teaching because we need truth. And good teaching does more than just tell you right from wrong. It gets into your head and even into your heart with a vision of the good life. Good teaching undermines the stories we believe that are not reality and replaces them with stories to believe that are reality. It says this is true and this is a lie. This is why Jesus would so often tell stories. And we tragically err as 21st century Westerners when we read his parables and think they're sermon illustrations that are like telling a cute story about my kids or something. These were subversive, radical, countercultural narratives, often that were very similar to common stories of his day that he would just tweak in order to just mess with people's worldview. This is the role of truth. And in our spiritual formation, the role of truth or reality or the narratives we live by is key. Human beings, what separates human beings from the animals above all is, you could either argue it's our will, our capacity to choose, or you could say at a mental level, it is our ability to hold unreality in our mind and then bring it into reality through our body. So this is what everything you do, from making breakfast in the morning to raising a child to starting a business, no animal has this capacity. You can imagine in your mind's eye something that does not exist, from a cupcake to a business to a house to a child. You can imagine it in your mind, and then through your body, you can bring the cupcake into being or bring the business. Think about a business. A business is an idea. It does not exist until you bring it into being with your body. But tragically, this capacity is also our Achilles heel. Not only do we have the capacity to hold unreality in our mind, we also have the capacity to then trust as if that unreality is true, and then live as if that unreality is true. This is why when the devil in the Genesis story comes to Eve, he does not come at her with a stick, but with an idea. Because again, we live from ideas. The devil's primary work, I deeply believe, in our world, especially in the Western world, is in the world of ideas that govern the structures and the systems of our society and our soul. What teaching does is it rewires our mental maps to reality, which then in turn makes it possible for us to show up to reality, whether it's to show up to our sexuality, our gender, our marriage, our relationships, our church, our spirituality, social justice, to show up to reality well. Nowhere is this more true, and then the teaching that we receive and what comes into our mind about God. Because we will become like our vision of God, for better or for worse, which is why Jesus' teaching, and even more the teaching of his life example of what God is like, is paramount in all of this. Now again, by teaching, I mean more than just a sermon or what I'm doing right now. This is reading the scriptures, this is a podcast, this is reading a book, this is neuroplasticity and Hebb's law, neurons that fire together, wire together. This is meditation, this is even prayer. Paul calls it in Romans 12, we read that, the renewal of the mind. This is how we're transformed, or the beginning of our transformation. And again, Christians seem to just instinctively get this. Like you put Christians from pretty much any culture together for very long, and they're going to have a Bible study. They're going to read a book. They're going to listen to a podcast. They're going to sit around and talk about it and have discussion questions. Like just Christians, something about us must read Bible and talk about it, or something. And this is beautiful. Christians sell a per capita. It's interesting. We're this tiny population demographic. Did you know that the reason there's a Christian publishing industry is because Christians consume this massive statistical chunk of the publishing industry. We're just readers across the world. We read, we think, we study the Bible, we memorize scripture. This is instinctively, I think, us saying yes to the Spirit in us, saying, man, Jesus was a rabbi, he was a teacher. We need this truth in our mind. But teaching, getting right ideas into our head and even to our heart is not enough. We also need practice. Counter the habits that do something to us are the practices of Jesus, which are just, if you want to call them the spiritual disciplines, that's fine as well. Back to the Sermon on the Mount, I think we have a slide here. People read the Sermon on the Mount and think, oh man, that's unrealistic, it's so high, it's out of this world. And people often forget that at the very beginning of the sermon, first thing before his first kind of teaching, and at the very end, Jesus has a line about practice. He writes this in the beginning: anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands that he's about to lay out and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. There's practice and teaching. Next slide. At the very end, last thing, the story of the two houses, the two building projects. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like the wise person who built their house on the rock, if you know that story. Jesus assumes that this way of life that he has on offer, that we read in the Sermon on the Mount, is going to take a life of practice in community. He just assumes this. Yet often, many of us don't think of our life with Jesus as a kind of practice. Richard Foster, who was kind of in the Protestant tradition, his book, The Celebration of Discipline, in 1978, was kind of the beginning of this whole conversation that we're still in right now. And after he was this little-known Quaker pastor, actually right outside my city in a tiny little college town, church of 100 people or something like that. His book became this, million-seller kind of thing, swept through the Western church. And he began to travel around for many years after that and just teach on spiritual formation, like what I'm doing, but better. And he said, after a decade of that, he said his conclusion by experience, not just in America, all over the Western church, was that most people think they change by trying really hard, not by training really hard. And for him, it came down to that, trying versus training. How we approach transformation is, here's the vision, go try to do it really hard. So we have a teaching on anxiety. Jesus has this whole vision of you become a non-anxious presence, and then it's like, okay, so everybody, this week, don't worry. And you make it to the parking lot and you get an email from your boss and you're like, duh, and you're racked by anxiety. You're not even home yet, or whatever it is for you. When really the role, it's about training. The best analogy I can think of, let's say you're here, you all look like fit New Zealanders, but hypothetical scenario. You're here and you're just way out of shape and you're overweight and you've spent time in America and you're asthmatic and whatever it is. And you decide, you know what, I'm a holistic being, it's not about image or any of that stuff, but I want to be healthy. So you decide to run a marathon. I don't know what a marathon is in kilometers. I have no idea. How many? 42? Great. So you decide you want to run 42 kilometers. How do you change? How do you become the kind of person who can run 42 kilometers? Do you wake up tomorrow morning, have a banana and a glass of water, and just try really hard and go run 42 kilometers? No, of course not. What would happen if you tried really hard? You would die. You'd die. You'd make it to, kilometer 5, 10, 15, if you're already kind of your former athlete or whatever. Maybe, if Newt came along and was like driving in the car and praying for you, you'd make it to kilometer 20, and then you'd die and just collapse on the side of the road, leaking lung fluid, and we would call an ambulance or whatever. Because we all know that's not. And the thing is, listen, it's not that you can't run a marathon. Any one of you pretty much, unless if you have some kind of a handicap, any one of you could do that. It's that you can't do it yet. And the way you become the kind of person who can run a marathon is not through trying really hard. It's just through training. You wake up tomorrow morning, and anybody who's ever done a marathon or half marathon, it's very easy. I don't know what it is in kilometers. In miles, you just start with 1 mile, and then every week you just add on an extra mile to your long run. So week 1, your long run is a mile. Week 2, your long run is 2 miles. Week 3, it's 3, and then normally you do 3, and then you take a break, and then you start at 3 again, 4, 5, break, 5, 6, 7, break, 7, 8, 9. And what happens is over a long period of time, for a marathon it'd be about 6 months normally, all of a sudden you ratchet up to your long run is, again, kilometers, it would be 30 kilometers, 35, 40, you become the kind of person for whom running a marathon is hard, will always be hard, but it is well within your capacity. It's the kind of person you have become, not through trying really hard, but through training really hard. Does that make sense? So the problem is very few of us apply this common sense logic to our apprenticeship to Jesus, to our anxiety, to our lustfulness, to our discontent and our ennui and our restlessness, to our temper with our kids. Very few of us think that way. Again, we think just study the Bible or sing and wait for the zap. both of which are beautiful. But training is how we just present ourselves before God day after day after day. Now, what most people call the practices or the training of Jesus are the spiritual disciplines. We'll talk more about that tonight. We'll do an in-depth thing about that. I don't call them that for all sorts of reasons. But whatever you call these training habits, these practices, these spiritual disciplines, these details based on the lifestyle of Jesus, all they are counter habits. So if Netflix is doing one thing to you, do you have Netflix here? And alcohol is doing one thing to you, and your friends are doing one thing to you, and your education system is doing one thing to you, you begin to take on the counter habits of Jesus. You begin your day in the quiet, in prayer and in scripture. You do life around a table with people who follow Jesus. You present yourself at church on a Sunday. You come to an event like this. Are you trying really hard right now? You just feel like, ah! No, you're just sitting there, sipping coffee and bored with me talking too long. But you're training. Right now, something is happening to you. Third is community. What's the difference between, back to that paradigm, between relationships is community? What's the difference? Well, not much, but, relationships we self-select based on preference. Community is more like family. You have little no say in who your family is. You may love them, you may not, but they are your family. And they are people that you grow with, that you mature with, the place that you belong and the place that you become. By community, I mean the full range of relationships with other followers of Jesus, from your community, your church, your best friend, a roommate, a spouse, a therapist, a spiritual director, a pastor, a mentor, a parent. Community is an incubator for our spiritual formation. It's the context where all of this happens. You can't do this alone. If you want to just you and Jesus and podcasts, you will never be transformed in the way that you want to. Community is where we grow and we mature and we succeed and we fail and we drop the ball and we mess up and we get off track, all in the loving presence not only of God, but of the people of God. Community does two things that you really can't get anywhere else: exposure and encouragement. Exposure, when you live in community, the best in you will come out and the worst in you will come out, right? Any kind of community, any kind of close relationship. That's why so many people live in a series of short-term relationships, because they're scared to get close, because they know who they actually are will come out. This is the conspiracy that you married couples know, or even just any of you in a family know, that we tend to be our worst when we're with the people that we love the most. If you were to just put a hidden camera on me and follow me around and just wait for the dirt, all of the worst stuff that you would see is how I interact with my wife and my 3 children, who are the people I love the most. And I want to believe that's because for some reason you bring out the worst in me or whatever. Actually, it's not true. I'm not my worst self with them. I'm my real self. It's actually the gift of community. We instinctively, at a neurobiological level, we just let down our guard and we are us with a close friend or a roommate or a parent or or a child or a spouse. You're who you actually are, and it actually can be really hard to face. But it's such a gift because who you are comes to the surface in all of its beauty and all of its ugliness. And in a healthy community, not perfect, that doesn't exist. And if it does, don't join it. But in a healthy community, it won't be perfect anymore. In a healthy community, that's what I meant, sorry. Oh my goodness. Can I say it? Oh, I said it. Now anyway, in process, people, in process. In a healthy community, there's exposure, but there's also encouragement. There's this sense like a healthy, whether it's a spouse or a best friend or a parent or a people, we constantly find ourselves saying to each other, that's not who you really are. And calling each other away from our sin, if you want to use that language, into Christ's likeness. This is what community does. Now, and community is hard. I don't care if you're an extrovert or an introvert. It's a myth that extroverts are more into community than introverts, right? Community is not the same thing as being social or having fun with people. It's in-depth relationships with other people who follow Jesus. Whether you're introverted, whether you're extroverted, whatever, community is messy. There's the ideal of community, then there's the reality of community. Because part of what it's supposed to do is exposure and then also encouragement. But community is non-negotiable. It is how we follow Jesus. Then we're transformed. Counter our environment is the Holy Spirit. Everything I said this morning about abiding, the dream is that as we present ourselves before God, that the Spirit of God becomes our environment more than Auckland for you or Portland for me, that we are then transformed by the role of the Spirit of God in our mind and our life. This paradigm here is a combination of our part and God's part together in our transformation. I think next slide, forgive some of the Portland language here, but if you were to separate out your responsibility from God's responsibility, as I see it, our responsibility is just the practices in community. We just do the practices of Jesus. We present our mind and our body before God in that way, and we do it together as a community. God's responsibility is to transform us through spirit and truth. Another way to frame that spirit and truth is Jesus language. Another way to say that is presence or even relationship and reality. Think about how, say, a therapy session, if you have a good therapist, is 10 times more transformative than a book. Because what is therapy? It's spirit and truth, if it's done well. You're in the presence, in relationship with a loving, wise soul, and truth is spoken into your life. And I can spend 45 minutes I have this Jesus, amazing 70-year-old therapist guy, and walk out a changed man. Nothing happened. I just sat there in spirit and in truth. That's just a small picture of what happens on a grand scale with the spirit and the truth of Jesus. Back to our other slide. My point is we have a responsibility teaching to expose ourselves to that, mostly practice in community, but it's the truth and it's the Spirit of God that we in the end are transformed by. Some people, again, back to those two myths and misconceptions, either err on one of two sides. Either they're just trying really hard and striving and exhausted all the time, trying to become like Jesus and just no fun to be around, the older brother in Jesus' parable. Or it's the opposite, just this kind of lazy, laissez-faire, like, God will do it, let go, let God. And you're like, you keep letting go, come on, God, whatever it is. And if you err on either extreme, it's a refusal to take the both and of this seriously. I deeply believe that God is the one that does almost all of our transformation. This is what's different from spiritual formation to anything in therapy or self-help or any of that, the habit stuff. But at the same time, God has so much respect for your dignity, your humanity, your freedom, and everything's about relationship with Him. And so it's a relational responsibility as we present ourselves before God. All of this happens, of course, over time. This doesn't happen if you want to follow Jesus and become like Him. It's not like, great, I'll do that this year. It's like a lifelong journey. It's painfully slow in my experience. If there's a silver bullet, if there's a shortcut, I have no idea what it is, but other than suffering, and I don't want to sign up for that. So please, if you have another idea than suffering, please come up and tell me afterwards. But in my experience, this is a long, lifelong process in a culture of instant gratification, which is why I think so many people give up and settle. They just say, well, I'll always have an anger problem. I'll always be sarcastic. I'll always be kind of lazy. Whatever your thing is. because we're not willing to just stay with Jesus over the long haul. And his invitation is just come, follow me, and don't stop. So much of do you know the word faith out of the Reformation can just as well be translated faithfulness. And many scholars argue we should have used the English word faithfulness. It's just as much about staying true to Jesus as it is believing the right things in your head. It takes time. And there's double entendre there. Of course, it's about the amount of time that we give to it as well. And finally, through the hard knocks of life, in the language of the theologian Jay-Z. Whether or not you are an apprentice of Jesus, life is not easy. An easy life's not an option. An easy yoke is, an easy life isn't. But ironically, it's the hard times that our entire Western world is just running away from through escapism that have the most potential to transform us into Christ-likeness. I mean, this is just cue any number of scriptures. James 1, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. The testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let it finish its work in you, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. That's one of so many, over and over, the writers of Scripture make the point that it's the times that we avoid, that we mitigate against, that we get insurance for, that we run away from, that actually have the most potential, even if they're heinous, even if they're not God's will, even if they're demonic. They actually have the most potential to transform you and me. That language there of active and passive spirituality is honestly a whole other session I don't have time for. That's language from the Middle Ages and the historic church. It's not language we use anymore. What they mean is there are certain aspects of our spiritual formation where it feels active. It feels more like we take the initiative. I'm going to read through the Bible in a year. I'm going to pray every morning. I'm going to do the exam before I go to bed. I'm going to go to Bible study on Thursday night. It feels more like you have the initiative. And there are other aspects that feel more passive, meaning it feels more like you're just receiving the invitations of God in your stage of life and in your suffering. And the more I get into this, the more I realize, man, the passive dimensions of our spiritual formation are some of the most evocative. One of the hardest things for me to grapple with in the last year has been the acknowledgement that I am not in charge of my spiritual formation. Jesus is my shepherd, not me. This is not Project Self with Jesus there to baptize it. This is apprenticeship to Jesus. He's the pastor, I'm the sheep. I've been around sheep. You have a lot in your country. It's not the most flattering image, but it's beautiful. And so it's often in these moments of suffering that we just avoid like the plague, even if they're not God's will for your life, even if God's hand was not involved in that pain, that illness, it was demonic, it was life, it was just chaos theory, it was whatever. Still, there are invitations of God for you just to say yes in that season. What is God wanting to do in me? And everything in our culture will just want you to escape and get back to looking and feeling good. The invitation of Jesus is always to turn and face your suffering or your season head on, whether it's little kids or retirement or whatever it is, and just accept the invitations of God to go deeper, to meet God in your pain and let him transform you right there. So to recap, how do we change to become more like Jesus? Through teaching, through practice, in community, all by the Holy Spirit. And this happens over time and through the hard knocks of life. So to circle back to our kind of question, is transformation possible? Yes, heck yes. But it's not inevitable. It's not like just, read your Bible once in a while, go to church every other Sunday, boom, 50 years later, you will become Jesus of Nazareth, the second, or whatever. I wish that was true, right? I wish it was true. That's beautiful. It's not a bad thing. It's wonderful. It's not enough to stand against the overwhelming tide of our culture, of the stories that we believe, the habits we live into, our relationships, our environment. It's just not enough. A story is told about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who started, if you know his story, started this little seminary called Finkenwald in what's now Poland, was Germany at the time, because he wanted to form pastors that were basically countercultural agents against Nazism. And this is right before World War II kicked off. And he came from money, came from an upper-class secular home. Liberal progressive Christianity started in Germany and ironically gave birth to Nazism first. Before it was leftist, it was rightist. And his family just thought he was wasting his life. He gave up a professorship to go out with 150 seminary students, and they'd just pray all the time and do Jesus stuff, and it's just beautiful. His book, Life Together, was based on that. So at one point, a family friend comes out basically to talk sense into Bonhoeffer and say, you are a PhD, you're one of the brightest minds in our country, you gave up a professorship, you come from money, like, what are you doing out here in, rural Poland with 120 seminarians, like, doing your thing? Come back to the university, come back to your family and your life. And the story goes, Bonhoeffer gets in a rowboat with this guy, and he just doesn't say anything, he's just quiet. He says, come with me. They row across this lake, and on the other side of the lake, there's a rise, and they walk up the rise, and there's a German military base on the side. Planes are taking off, and there's Hitler Youth down there training. And he points across the lake at his tiny little seminary, and he says, this must be stronger than that. And he gets back in the rowboat and goes home. And his point was, this, our apprenticeship to Jesus, has to be stronger than that, than the city outside these walls. Whatever it is that you do as you follow Jesus has to be stronger than the stories of your city, the habits of your city, the relationships and environment of your city. So to end, would you just stand with me, and then I'll turn it over in just a moment to Calvin. I'm way over time. An exercise that I find helpful, that I would love to invite you into sometime today. If you have a break now and you want to take a little stroll for a cup of coffee, or tonight as you're falling asleep, or even right now, is just to plot the trajectory of your character arc out 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, and just in the safe place of the Father's overwhelming love, delight, and smile over you, just ask yourself the question, who am I becoming? Because at the end of the day, who we're becoming matters more than anything else. And by that I mean who we're becoming in relationship to Jesus. I care so much about faith and work and culture and all of that. But really, at the end of the day, what will matter a million years from today is the person that you become through relationship to Jesus and his community. Our culture just says a million other things are more important than that. But that's it. And in the safe place of the Father's love, God, even now, we just invite your gentle nudge. Would you, right now, I just want to give a moment of quiet before Calvin comes. Would you just open up your mind, not for the voice of guilt or shame, but would you just open up your mind and ask the Spirit of God to give you a vision of yourself, if you're 20 at 50, if you're 50 at 80, of yourself down the road, the Christ-like you, the set-free, whole, not perfect you, perfection is not on offer, but the whole, healthy, mature, Christ-like you. Would you let the Spirit put in your mind's eye a vision of who Jesus is calling you to become as you journey with him and are transformed by his Spirit and by his truth as you just show up over the long haul? Let's just, before Calvin comes, just take a moment. Spirit of God, come into our mind and our imagination now. Give us a vision. Come and do it. We know you want to.